Sterling and Co. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the quiet hum of power. Julian Sterling, the 34-year-old CFO of the firm, leaned back in his leather chair, his tailored suit fitting him like armor. He was a man of cold logic and calculated risks, known in the industry as the Ice King. Across from him sat Marcus Thorne, Julian's longtime rival and the company's COO. They were celebrating a successful merger, but the conversation had turned cynical. Marcus, fueled by a third glass of scotch, gestured toward the window. "You think you've mastered life, Julian, because you can read a spreadsheet. But you have no heart. You treat people like assets. I bet you couldn't even maintain a basic human connection with someone who wasn't handpicked by a PR team." Julian smirked, his eyes sharp. "Human connection is just another system of incentives, Marcus. People are predictable." "Is that so?" Marcus leaned in, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Then prove it. There's a challenge for you. You're always talking about restructuring lives. Marry someone from the absolute bottom of the ladder, someone invisible, a homeless person. Keep her as your legal wife for 6 months. If you don't crack, if you can actually make a project out of a person and keep your reputation intact, I'll hand over my shares in the offshore venture. If you fail, you resign." It was an absurd, cruel proposal, born of wealth-induced boredom and spite. Julian should have walked away. But the offshore venture was worth tens of millions, and his ego was larger than the city skyline. "Fine," Julian said, his voice a low vibration. "But I choose the candidate. I won't have a drug addict in my penthouse." An hour later, Julian's black SUV pulled up near a soup kitchen in the International District. He stepped out, his polished shoes splashing in the oily puddles. That's when he saw her. Under the flickering light of a bus stop sat a woman, perhaps in her late 20s, huddled over a small child. She wasn't begging. She was reading a tattered book to the boy by the dim street lamp. Her clothes were layers of oversized flannels and a worn-out coat, but her posture was strangely dignified. Her name was Elena. She looked up as Julian approached, her eyes, a striking, weary hazel, narrowing in suspicion. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a soldier in a war no one else was fighting. "We don't want any trouble," she said, her voice raspy from the cold. "I'm not here to give you trouble," Julian said, realizing for the first time that this challenge was about to become very real. "I'm here to offer you a contract, a legal marriage, a home for your son, safety. In exchange, you simply have to exist in my world for 6 months." Elena looked at her son, Leo, who was shivering. She looked back at Julian, seeing the coldness in his eyes, but also the expensive fabric of his coat. She didn't ask about love. She didn't ask about why. She asked, "Will he have his own bed?" "He will have his own wing," Julian replied. And so, the bargain was struck in the rain. The transition from the streets to Julian's minimalist penthouse in Capitol Hill was jarring. For Elena, the silence of the apartment was louder than the noise of the city. The floors were polished white marble, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the Space Needle that felt like a mockery of her previous life. Julian had arranged for a team of stylists and a discreet lawyer. By the second day, Elena had been scrubbed clean, her matted hair cut into a sleek professional bob, and her wardrobe replaced with understated designer pieces. However, the physical transformation couldn't hide the way she flinched at sudden movements or how she hoarded bread rolls from the dinner table, hiding them in her coat pockets out of habit. "You don't need to do that," Julian said one evening, watching her hide a piece of sourdough. "The pantry is always full." Elena looked at him, her gaze piercing. "Abundance is a temporary state, Mr. Sterling. I've learned that the hard way." Julian felt a flicker of annoyance. He had expected gratitude, or perhaps awe. Instead, he got a woman who treated his home like a temporary shelter. He had set up a bedroom for Leo, a room filled with more toys than the boy had ever seen. But Leo wouldn't sleep in the bed. He slept on the rug next to it, curled into a ball. The marriage was formalized in a private ceremony at City Hall. No guests, just signatures. To the world, Julian announced he had met an old friend from college, and they had eloped. It was a lie designed to protect his corporate image, but Marcus Thorne was watching closely, waiting for the cracks to show. As the days turned into weeks, Julian found himself distracted. He would be in the middle of a high-stakes conference call and find himself looking at the security feed of his living room. He watched Elena teaching Leo how to draw. She moved with a grace that didn't match the homeless woman archetype Julian had built in his mind. She was articulate, her vocabulary was refined, and she spoke with an accent that suggested a high-level education. One night, he found her in his private library. She was holding a first-edition copy of a complex architectural history book. She wasn't just looking at the pictures. She was reading the footnotes. "That's a rare volume," Julian said, leaning against the door frame. Elena didn't jump. She slowly closed the book. The Gothic influence on Pacific Northwest structures is fascinating, although the author ignores the structural limitations of the 1920s soil density in this region. Julian froze. "How do you know about soil density?" Elena's face went pale, a mask of practiced neutrality slamming back into place. "I picked up bits and pieces over the years. I should go. Leo might wake up." She hurried past him, leaving the scent of sandalwood and something metallic: fear. Julian realized then that he hadn't married a charity case. He had married a woman with a past that was carefully buried under layers of trauma and rain. The social season in Seattle was in full swing, and Marcus Thorne decided to force Julian's hand. He organized a charity gala for the Urban Renewal Initiative, a cruel irony considering the bet. Julian was forced to bring Elena. "Remember," Julian whispered as they stepped out of the limousine into a swarm of photographers, "you are Elena Vance, a former freelance consultant. Keep the conversation light. Don't mention the streets." Elena looked stunning in a deep emerald silk gown. She held Julian's arm with a grip that was almost painful. "I know how to play a part, Julian. Better than you think." The gala was a minefield. Julian watched as Elena navigated the room. He expected her to be overwhelmed by the opulence, but she was unnervingly calm. She spoke to the mayor about urban zoning laws. She discussed modern art with the board of the Seattle Art Museum. She was the star of the evening, and Julian felt a strange, uncharacteristic surge of pride. However, the peace was shattered when a prominent real estate developer, Thomas Sterling, Julian's estranged, overbearing father, approached them. Thomas was a man who valued bloodlines and prestige above all else. "So this is the woman who captured my son's icy heart," Thomas boomed, his eyes scanning Elena with clinical coldness. "Vance, you say?" "I knew a Vance family in San Francisco. Architects. They went through a rather explosive scandal 5 years ago. Embezzlement, if I recall. The father ended up in prison, and the daughter vanished." Elena's hand began to shake. The color drained from her lips. Julian felt the tremor through her arm. "The name is common, Father." Julian stepped in, his voice dropping an octave. "Don't bore my wife with your gossip." "Is it?" Thomas smirked. "The daughter was quite brilliant, a prodigy in structural engineering. It's a shame. Most people thought she died in the fallout." Elena suddenly pulled her arm away. "Excuse me," she choked out. "I need some air." She bolted toward the balcony. Julian followed, his mind racing. He found her gripping the stone railing, gasping for breath as the cold rain began to fall on her expensive dress. "Elena, I can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He knows. They'll find me." "Who will find you? What happened in San Francisco?" Julian stepped closer, his instinct to protect overriding his desire for the bet. "I wasn't just homeless because of bad luck, Julian," she said, looking at him with eyes full of tears and terror. "I was erased. I was a whistleblower for a firm that was cutting corners on skyscraper foundations. They framed my father. They took our home, and when I tried to fight back, they sent people to make sure I stayed quiet. I've been hiding for 5 years to keep Leo safe." Julian looked at the woman he had bought for a bet and realized she was a survivor of a war he couldn't even imagine. The revelation changed the dynamics of the penthouse. Julian found himself no longer looking at Elena as a project, but as a person under siege. He began to use his vast resources not to win a bet, but to investigate the Vance family scandal. He discovered that Elena was, in fact, Elena Vance, a graduate of Stanford, and a rising star in engineering. Her father had died in prison under suspicious circumstances 2 years ago. The company she had whistled blown on, Apex Global, was a shadowy conglomerate with ties to several of Julian's own business associates, including Marcus Thorne. Julian realized with a jolt of adrenaline that Marcus hadn't picked Elena at random. The challenge was a setup. Marcus knew who she was. He wanted her out in the open so his partners could finish the job and discredit Julian in the process. "We're moving," Julian said one morning, finding Elena in the kitchen. "What? Why?" "Marcus Thorne knows who you are. The bet wasn't a game, it was a trap. You and Leo aren't safe here." For the first time, Elena saw Julian not as a cold businessman, but as a man who was genuinely worried. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. But it was immediately followed by guilt. "Julian, if you help me, they'll come for you too. Your reputation, your company, they'll destroy it all." "Let them try," Julian said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I'm the CFO of Sterling & Co. I know where every dollar is buried. If they want to fight, I'll give them a recession." He moved them to a highly secured estate on Mercer Island. He hired private security for Leo. He began working late into the night, not on mergers, but on a legal counter-offensive. One night, Julian returned home to find Elena waiting for him with a simple meal she had cooked herself, the first time she had used the kitchen. As they ate, the silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy with unspoken things. "Why are you doing this, Julian?" she asked softly. "The 6 months aren't up. You could just give Marcus what he wants and walk away." Julian looked at her, really looking at her. He saw the strength in her jaw and the softness in the way she looked at her son. At first, it was about the win. Then it was about the injustice. But now... He paused, his cold exterior finally cracking. "Now, I realize that I was the one who was lost, Elena. I had everything and felt nothing. You had nothing and felt everything. I think I'm the one who's being rescued." The peace of Mercer Island was short-lived. Marcus Thorne struck back, not with violence, but with the weapon he knew Julian feared most: public scandal. A tabloid headline broke: "CFO's Cinderella is a wanted fugitive's daughter. Julian Sterling marries into scandal." The article twisted Elena's past, making it seem like she was part of her father's alleged embezzlement scheme, and that Julian was using his position to launder money for her. The Sterling-encumbered board of directors went into a frenzy. Julian was summoned to an emergency meeting. "You have to divorce her, Julian," his father Thomas demanded in the boardroom. "It's a PR nightmare. Cut her loose, and we can spin this as you being a victim of a con artist." Julian stood at the head of the long mahogany table. He looked at the men who had been his mentors and peers. They looked like vultures. "She didn't con me. She's a whistleblower who was silenced by a corrupt system. A system that some of you might be very familiar with." "Careful, Julian," Marcus Thorne said from the corner, a smug grin on his face. "You're choosing a homeless girl over your legacy." "I'm choosing the truth over a lie," Julian retorted. "And as of this moment, I am launching a full forensic audit of every Sterling & Cumber Partners connection to Apex Global. If you want to talk about scandals, let's talk about why our firm has been facilitating their offshore accounts for years." The room went silent. Julian had just declared war on his own world. He returned home to find Elena packing her bags. "What are you doing?" he asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I saw the news," she said, her eyes red from crying. "I'm ruining you. I can't let you lose everything because of me. Leo and we're used to running. We can survive." Julian walked over and took the suitcase out of her hand. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Stop running, Elena. For once in your life, stay. I don't care about the company. I don't care about the money. I've lived in a golden cage my whole life, and I didn't realize it until I met you." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm not protecting a project anymore. I'm protecting my wife. I'm protecting my family." The word family hung in the air, heavy and transformative. Elena let out a sob, her resolve finally breaking, and she clung to him. In the quiet of the fortified house, the Ice King finally melted. The dining room of the Mercer Island estate had been transformed into a high-tech war room. The expansive mahogany table, once reserved for silent, lonely dinners, was now buried under stacks of bank statements, blueprints, and encrypted hard drives. The air was thick with the smell of strong espresso and the ozone of overclocked laptops. Julian had bypassed his own company's IT department, hiring a red team of independent forensic auditors who worked in the shadows. Elena sat at the center of the chaos, her eyes bloodshot but sharp. The transformation was startling. She no longer wore the oversized hoodies of the street, but a crisp white button-down that signaled her return to the professional world she had been exiled from. She wasn't just a guest, she was the architect of Marcus Thorne's downfall. "Julian, look at this," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. She tapped a finger on a structural report from 5 years ago. Project Emerald Spire. My father flagged the seismic dampers. He wrote that the steel alloy was brittle, cheaper, non-compliant. Here's the internal memo from Apex Global telling him to adjust his findings. And look at the date of the wire transfer to Thorne's offshore account. It was the same day the city inspector signed off on the spire. Julian leaned over her, his hand resting instinctively on her shoulder. The physical proximity, once calculated, now felt as natural as breathing. He analyzed the numbers with the cold precision that had made him a billionaire, but his heart was racing for a different reason. Thorne wasn't just taking bribes, Julian whispered. He was the one organizing the shell companies. He used Sterling and Co.'s infrastructure to launder the kickbacks from the construction firms. It's a closed loop. As the days bled into nights, the bond between them solidified in the quiet hours. Between the data mining, they found moments of profound humanity. Julian, the man who previously viewed children as future liabilities, found himself on the rug with Leo every evening. He taught the boy the Sicilian defense in chess, fascinated by how the child's mind worked, a blend of Elena's brilliance and the survival instincts of the street. "Checkmate," Leo whispered one night, a tiny proud smile breaking across his face. Julian laughed, a deep, genuine sound that echoed through the sterile house. "You've got your mother's eyes for strategy, Leo. Never let them see your next move." But the shadow of Marcus Thorne was lengthening. One evening, after a clandestine meeting with a federal prosecutor at a rainy diner in Bellevue, Julian was driving his SUV back toward the island. The Seattle rain was a deluge, reducing visibility to mere feet. Suddenly, headlights blinded him from the rear-view mirror. 2 black SUVs boxed him in. One clipped his rear bumper, sending him into a terrifying skid. The crunch of metal on the guardrail was deafening. Julian's airbag deployed, the smell of cordite filling the cabin. He sat there for a moment, blood trickling from a cut on his temple, watching as the black SUVs slowed down just enough for a passenger to look at him, then sped off into the darkness. It wasn't an assassination attempt. It was a psychological strike. Julian climbed out of the wreck, his tailored suit jacket torn, his arm throbbing with a dull, sickening heat. He didn't call 911. He pulled out his phone and dialed his head of security. Thorne just showed his hand. He's scared. We don't wait for the audit to finish. We go public at the shareholders' meeting tomorrow. Mobilize the legal team. We're going for the throat. When he walked through the front door of the estate, Elena screamed. She ran to him, her hands fluttering over his bloodied face. "Julian, oh God, they tried to kill you. I knew this would happen. It's happening all over again." She began to hyperventilate, the trauma of her past crashing into the present. She grabbed his hand, her grip bruising. "Julian, please. We have the money you gave us. Let's just take Leo and drive north. We can be in Vancouver by morning. We can change our names. I can't lose someone else to these people." Julian took her by the waist, ignoring the pain in his arm, and pulled her close. "Elena, look at me. For 5 years, you've been a ghost. You've lived in fear of the shadows. If we run now, Leo grows up thinking that the world belongs to the bullies. I have spent my life building walls of money. Tomorrow, I'm going to use those walls to crush them. We aren't running. We're fighting." That night, the boundaries they had maintained out of respect and fear dissolved. They stayed in the same room, not for passion, but for the fundamental human need for warmth in the face of a storm. As the rain lashed against the windows, Julian held her, promising a tomorrow that neither of them was sure would come. The Seattle Convention Center was a hive of activity. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the nervous energy of the city's financial elite. The annual Sterling & Cumber shareholders meeting was being broadcast live on financial news networks. Marcus Thorne stood backstage, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror. He looked triumphant. He had the board's support. The narrative of Julian's instability was set, and he believed Julian was too injured, or too scared, to show up. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, stepping onto the podium. His voice was smooth, practiced. "It is with a heavy heart that the board of directors must address the recent erratic behavior of our CFO, Julian Sterling. While we value his past contributions, his recent associations, and the subsequent scandals have put our firm's reputation at risk. Today, we move for a vote of no confidence." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Just as Marcus moved to call the vote, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall slammed open. The sound was like a gunshot. Julian Sterling walked down the center aisle. He wasn't wearing the pristine robotic suit of the Ice King. He wore a simple navy blazer, his arm in a discreet black sling, a bandage still visible on his temple. But beside him, the room gasped as Elena Vance stepped into the light. She was dressed in a charcoal power suit, her head held high, looking every bit the brilliant engineer she was. "The only thing at risk in this room, Marcus, is your freedom," Julian's voice boomed, amplified by the hall's acoustics. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight onto the stage. "Security!" Marcus shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. "Remove them!" "Sit down, Marcus," Julian said, his voice dropping to a deadly, calm chill. He nodded to the tech booth. His team had already overridden the server. The massive 40-foot LED screens behind the podium flickered. Instead of the projected fourth-quarter earnings, a document appeared. A scanned copy of the original Apex Global Seismic Failure Report, signed by Elena's father, followed by a series of ledger entries from a bank in the Cayman Islands. "This is Elena Vance," Julian told the stunned audience. "She is an expert structural engineer. 5 years ago, her father died in prison because he refused to lie about the safety of the buildings many of you work in. And here," he pointed to the screen, "is the proof that Marcus Thorne was paid $12 million to ensure that silence." Elena stepped forward to the microphone. Her voice was steady, though her heart was pounding against her ribs. "My father was a good man. He was destroyed by the greed in this room. I have spent years in the dirt of this city, watching you all build your empires on foundations that are literally crumbling. Today, the truth comes out." The screens began to scroll through emails. Thorne's personal correspondence regarding the removal of the Vance family. The evidence was overwhelming, forensic, and undeniable. The hall erupted in a cacophony of shouting. Shareholders were standing on chairs, reporters were screaming questions, and the board members were scrambling to distance themselves from Marcus. "You destroyed everything for a girl from the street," Marcus hissed, his face inches from Julian's, his mask of civility completely gone. "You burned $1 billion legacy for a nobody." Julian looked at him with a pity that was more insulting than anger. "No, Marcus. I saved everything. I saved my soul. And as for Elena, she's the only person in this room who actually knows how to build something that lasts." 2 FBI agents, who had been briefed by Julian's legal team that morning, stepped onto the stage. The click of handcuffs was picked up by the microphone, a metallic finality that echoed through the hall. As Thorne was led away, Julian didn't feel the rush of victory he expected. He only felt a deep, profound sense of relief. He turned to Elena, and in front of the flashing cameras of the world's press, he took her hand. In the weeks following the great collapse of Sterling & Marries, the world felt like it was moving in slow motion. The company went into a complex receivership process, and Julian resigned immediately. He didn't want to be the one to pick up the pieces of a poisoned legacy. He liquidated his majority shares, donating a massive portion to a trust for the residents of the buildings with faulty foundations. The media was relentless. They were no longer the Ice King and the Vagrant. They were the whistleblower's vengeance. Paparazzi camped outside the Mercer Island gates. For Elena, the transition was agonizing. For years, her safety had depended on her invisibility. Now, her face was on every newsstand. She suffered from night terrors, waking up screaming that the black SUVs were coming for Leo. One afternoon, Julian found her in Leo's room. The boy was at a playdate organized by the security team, and the house was hauntingly quiet. Elena was sitting on the floor, staring out at the gray expanse of Lake Washington. "The silence is the hardest part," she whispered, as Julian sat down beside her. "When I was on the street, I knew where the danger was. I could hear it coming. Now the world is cheering for me, but I feel like I'm waiting for the floor to give way. I don't know how to be Elena Vance again. That woman died 5 years ago." Julian took her hand, weaving his fingers through hers. "You're right. That woman did die. And the Julian Sterling who cared about the price of steel died too. We're two people who survived a wreck, Elena. We don't have to go back to who we were. We can be whoever we want. I want to go somewhere where the air doesn't smell like exhaust and secrets," she said, looking at him with a desperate hope. "I want Leo to go to a school where no one knows he used to sleep in a bus stop. I want to be a mother, not a headline." "Then we leave," Julian said firmly. "I've already looked at a property. It's north, in the Skagit Valley. It's an old farmhouse with 60 acres of cedar and mist. No paparazzi, no boardrooms. Just us. And your career, Julian. You were the most powerful CFO in the Northwest. You're only 34. You're just going to stop?" Julian looked at the lake, then back at her. For the first time, the ice in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a soft, clear light. "I spent my life counting other people's money and realizing I had nothing of my own. I have enough in the bank to buy the valley, Elena. I don't need a title. I just need a reason to wake up in the morning. I think you and Leo are a pretty good reason." They sold the penthouse, the estate, and the cars. They cut ties with the high society circles that had turned their backs on them during the scandal. As they packed the last of their belongings, Julian found the small, tattered book Elena had been reading to Leo the night they met in the rain. He tucked it into his jacket pocket, a reminder of where they started. The Skagit Valley was a world painted in strokes of emerald, gold, and the deep misty blue of the North Cascades. For Julian and Elena, it was more than just a change of scenery. It was a sanctuary. The farmhouse they had purchased was a sprawling, weather-beaten structure built in the early 1900s, featuring a wraparound porch that groaned pleasantly underfoot and windows that framed the shifting mountain clouds like living pieces of art. The transition to rural life was a series of small, healing rituals that stripped away the calloused layers of their previous lives. Julian, the man who once wouldn't touch a door handle without a sanitized wipe and viewed the world through the cold glow of a Bloomberg terminal, was now a man of the earth. He spent his mornings in the barn, his expensive silk shirts replaced by rugged denim and flannel. His hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused and often covered in the dark grease of an old 1950s tractor he was determined to restore. "It's about the mechanics, Elena," Julian said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow with a grease-stained rag. "In the city, I manipulated numbers that didn't exist. Here, if the fuel line is clogged, the engine doesn't turn. It's honest. It's real." Julian didn't just retire. He reinvested. He used his remaining millions to seed local sustainable farms and a green energy co-op. He became a silent partner to the men and women who worked the land, finding a deep, quiet respect for their labor that he had never felt for his fellow executives. Elena, meanwhile, found her true purpose. She partnered with a regional nonprofit, utilizing her engineering degree to oversee the Phoenix Project, a village of tiny homes designed for women and children escaping domestic violence. She was no longer a victim hiding in the shadows of Seattle's skyscrapers. She was a builder. She spent her days on construction sites, her sharp mind calculating load-bearing walls and foundation depths with a new sense of urgency. She wasn't just building houses, she was building safety. Every time she handed a key to a mother who had lost everything, she felt a piece of her own soul knit back together. She was the woman who knew exactly what it felt like to have no door to lock. And now, she was the one providing the keys. By October, the air in the valley had turned crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and wood smoke. The challenge that Marcus Thorne had proposed, that cruel, cynical bet, felt like a fever dream from a past life. The 6-month mark of their legal marriage arrived on a quiet Tuesday. Julian found Elena in the vegetable garden, her cheeks flushed a vibrant pink from the morning chill. She was kneeling in the rich soil, pulling the last of the heirloom carrots. Julian stood at the edge of the garden, holding a yellowed piece of paper. It was the original marriage contract, the document filled with cold clauses about duration, stipends, and termination rights. Elena looked up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the paper. Despite the love they had shared, a small, scarred part of her still lived in survival mode. She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Is it today?" she asked, her voice small. "Time for the payout? Time for the lawyers to finalize the exit strategy?" Julian didn't answer with words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver lighter. With a flick of his thumb, a small flame danced in the mountain breeze. He held the flame to the corner of the contract. They stood in silence as the fire consumed the legalese, the ink curling into black ash that blew away toward the mountains. "The man who signed that paper is dead, Elena," Julian said, stepping into her space. He took her dirt-stained hands in his. "I don't want a contract with you. I don't want a 6-month limit or a financial settlement. I want the next 60 years. I want to be the man you choose when there are no stakes left but our own happiness." Elena felt the last of her defenses, the walls she had built during 5 years of homelessness, finally crumble. She realized she wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. She was standing on the most solid foundation she had ever known. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears of pure relief. "Yes, Julian, 1,000 times." The moment was interrupted by a joyous shout. Leo came running out of the barn, his boots caked in Skagit mud, waving a drawing he had finished. It was a picture of the three of them, standing in front of the farmhouse under a giant smiling sun. At the bottom, in his improving blocky script, it said, "Our home." The wedding was held exactly 1 year after the fall of Marcus Thorne, during the height of the apple harvest. It was a simple private affair in the orchard behind the farmhouse, far from the prying eyes of the Seattle tabloids. The guests weren't billionaires or board members. They were the local farmers who had welcomed them, the women from the Phoenix Project, and the legal team that had stood by them during the trial. The orchard was a cathedral of gnarly branches and heavy red fruit. Julian stood at the altar, which he had milled himself from a fallen cedar tree on the property. He looked out at the small gathering, his heart full. When the music started, a simple acoustic guitar, Elena appeared from between the rows of trees. She wore a simple white linen dress that caught the afternoon light, her hair flowing naturally with a crown of wildflowers. She didn't look like the homeless mom Julian had met in the rain, nor did she look like the whistleblower hero of the news. She looked like a woman who was finally, completely at peace. As they stood hand in hand, Julian took a deep breath. His vows were not written by a PR team, they were written by his soul. "I spent my life looking at spreadsheets, trying to calculate the value of every human life as if it were a line item," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. Then I met a woman in the rain who had nothing. Yet she possessed a dignity I couldn't buy. You didn't just change my life, Elena. You gave me a life. You taught me that the only real wealth is the safety we provide for each other." Elena's response was a tribute to the strength of the human spirit. "You came into my life as a predator, Julian, a shark looking for a win in a cruel game. But you stayed as a protector. You didn't just give me a roof, you gave me back my identity. You gave Leo a father who believes in him, and you gave me the courage to stop running. Our love isn't a fairy tale because of the money we left behind. It's a fairy tale because we survived the truth and built something better on the ruins." The ceremony ended with a kiss that felt like a bridge to a new world. The reception was a celebration of life, rustic, warm, and loud with laughter. There was local cider, a bluegrass band playing under the stars, and the sight of Leo dancing with the neighbors' children. As the sun dipped behind the cascades, painting the sky in shades of deep violet and burnt orange, Julian and Elena shared their first dance on the grass. The story of the CFO and the homeless mom eventually became a legend in Seattle, a cautionary tale told in boardrooms about the dangers of arrogance, and a beacon of hope shared in shelters about the power of resilience. But in the Skagit Valley, they weren't legends. They were just Julian and Elena. In the final scene of their story, as the last of the guests departed and the stars began to pierce the velvet sky, The three of them stood on the wraparound porch. The Seattle rain began to fall. But here, it was a soft, misting rain that smelled of pine and damp earth. For the first time in her life, Elena didn't look for cover. She didn't flinch. She leaned her head on Julian's shoulder, felt Leo's small, warm hand in hers, and watched the rain water the land they had worked together. The Ice King was truly gone, replaced by a man who understood that the most important restructuring in the world is the one that happens inside a human heart. They were no longer defined by what they had lost, or what they had been forced to endure. They were the architects of their own peace, standing on a foundation that no scandal, no bet, and no storm could ever shake.